Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Now we'll resume where we left off yesterday in this book, The Global Vatican, by former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. We're going to show the listeners how the Vatican controls both foreign and domestic policy in the United States, and also is the orchestrator of the wars. And for what purpose? It's a very important book. It's written by a Roman Catholic, and we're going to read it from a Protestant point of view, a Protestant point of view. Now, yesterday we were still in talking about the pontificate of Antichrist Pope Pius XII and the Second World War, and the United States entering the war, and we're in a period where the United States was going to bomb the city of Rome. Now, not the Vatican. The United States promised not to touch the Vatican, but it was going to, well, punish Rome. And the question I raise is, were we punishing Rome because it was a fascist state, or were we punishing Rome on behalf of the Vatican because Rome put off or rejected the papacy's temporal power and sought to install a government of their own making, and thus separating the two keys, the silver key from the golden key representing the Pope's spiritual power, and the silver key representing the Pope's temporal or kingly power, his civil government. And the Romans chose to go with a republic and to separate those two keys. They were comfortable in allowing the Pope to be the spiritual ruler over their spiritual lives, but they rejected his temporal authority, seeking their own government, much like the Protestants did after the Protestant Reformation. They would allow Jesus to be their spiritual head, rejecting the golden key of the Pope too, and also overthrew their papal governments and established constitutional forms of government. Now, the bombs are ready to drop on Rome. The Pope's worried about it, claiming to be a Roman and claiming to be so concerned about the Roman people and about Rome proper. It says the bombs so dreaded by the Pope began to fall on Rome in the summer of 1943. The first air raid came on July 19th when 500 American planes roared over the city. And by the way, if you're following along, we're in the second full paragraph at the bottom of page 96. Just below the middle of the page on page 96. It says Vatican Hill gave a good view of the action, and Harold Titman's 14-year-old son visiting on break from school in Switzerland watched from the window of Darcy Osborne's apartment in Palazzo Santa Marta. Quote, flying in perfect formation of three, they swept toward their objectives, gleaming in the bright sunlight, the boy recorded in his journal. Quote, we had at first thought that they were bombing places around Rome, but when we saw huge clouds of smoke rising in the direction of the station, we knew that it was Rome's turn to suffer the horrors of war, unquote. Now continuing, it says the bombers targeted rail and freight yards, sparing historic and residential sections of the city. Inevitably, in those days of imprecise bombings, civilians were killed, perhaps as many as 1,500. Pope Pius XII had not left the Vatican since Italy entered the war 3 years earlier, but now, accompanied only by Monsignor Montini, who would eventually be Pope Paul VI, he sped in an automobile to the hard-hit neighborhood of San Lorenzo. The Pope prayed tearfully over the wreckage as Montini handed out alms to the stricken populace. Is this just another attempt to gain for the Pope plausible deniability for having anything to do with the bombing of Rome? Learn how Rome operates. Rome is always first at the scene of their crimes to condemn the crime. And I'll bring your attention back to September 11th, 9/11. One of the first to arrive on the scene was Pope Benedict XVI to splatter his holy water and to make phony prayers in the bathtub after the Twin Towers had been excavated from the site. The first to arrive at the scene of their crimes and to denounce those crimes is the one who committed the crime. You ever heard the expression, they returned to the scene of the crime? The papacy coined it. Okay? It's my belief that the papacy was behind the bombing of Rome. It was retaliation for the Roman people choosing to separate the two keys of the papacy and to establish their own government. The United States happened to be the battle axe, ready, willing, and able to do the papacy's bidding in Rome, and they did so. And the Pope was the first on the scene to tearfully curse the bombing and to hand out alms to the people. Now, events moved very fast after that initial Allied raid on Rome. On July 25th, Mussolini was deposed by the fascist Grand Council. The new government, under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, moved to have Rome declared an open city, to strip it of military assets in exchange for an agreement by the Allies to stop bombing it. The Vatican was the government's channel to the Allies to discuss terms. The Vatican's always there to discuss, to determine the terms of the peace. They start the war, they conduct the war through cooperative nations, and then they establish the peace. And the peace always benefits the papacy. All right, the Vatican was the government's channel to the Allies to discuss terms. And Harold Titman, as chief American diplomat in Rome, became the chief conduit between the Vatican and the United States. The Badoglio government wished for peace, Titman reported, but was held back by the threat of Nazi invasion. Its fears were justified. The moment an armistice between Italy and the Allies was announced on September 8th, the infuriated Germans attacked. 48 hours later, Rome was in the hands of the Nazis. And all the while, the Pope looks like a peacemaker. Now he says, and so back to where we began this long chapter of war, to St. Peter's Square. It is in the autumn of 1943, and Nazi troops surround the Vatican, armed with anti-tank artillery and machine guns. Motorcycle patrols speed along the edge of the square. A notice in front of St. Peter's Basilica warns away the curious and the devout. Quote, anyone attempting to enter will be shot, unquote. The Germans announced they are offering, quote-unquote, protection to the Pope. Quote, the German military authorities occupying Rome have the Vatican State lying almost helpless within their mailed fist, unquote, reports the New York Times on September 26th. Remember, Hitler is Pope Pius XII's man. He's leading this crusade. And the press in America is putting it out like Hitler is on the verge of overthrowing the Vatican to draw sympathy for the Vatican, to draw sympathy for the Antichrist, the one who is the power behind the power of Adolf Hitler. Now it says, quote, the physical conquest of the Vatican would be only a matter of hours should the Germans decide to attack, unquote, says the New York Times. As the Times notes, the Pope did have a few hundred of his own soldiers inside, including men of the Swiss Guard, the Palatine Guard, and the Nobles Guard. These men could be counted on, quote, to put up a stubborn resistance demanded by tradition and their high responsibility, but they would never have a chance, unquote. The Germans had every reason to attack, says this author. They suspected correctly that enemy refugees, including Jews, escaped prisoners of war, and supporters of the resistance were behind or hidden inside the Vatican, as well as in other Roman Catholic Church properties throughout Rome. Hitler knew that there were criminal refugees in the Vatican, that the Vatican was engaged in, well, illegal activity. And yet Hitler did nothing to stop it. Was it just an attempt for the Vatican to cover its own hide regarding the persecution of the Jews? Is that why they allowed Jews to become refugees in the Vatican? Just to cover Pope Pius XII's duplicity and complicity in the Holocaust? That's my assertion. He says protection operations of this magnitude were ensconced in dioceses all over Italy, led by local bishops and clergy. Some of these underground operations were run by Vatican prelates, such as Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty of Ireland, who was memorably portrayed by Gregory Peck in the movie entitled The Scarlet and the Black. Others were run by diplomats like Britain's Darcy Osborne. Harold Titman had himself been overseeing the shelter of 230 American prisoners of war who escaped before the Germans took over Rome. You see what role the Vatican, this neutral country, plays during times of war? They harbor the enemy, okay, so-called. In this case, it was a matter of giving plausible deniability to the Vatican for having anything to do with the Holocaust, since they had Jews holed up in the Vatican. He says the Germans, aware of these operations, plotted retaliation. Heinrich Himmler, head of the German SS, talked of ridding the Vatican of its, quote, nest of spies, unquote, while Adolf Hitler discussed plans to kidnap the Pope and loot the church of its treasures. Okay? That's public fodder to confuse you. Hitler did none of that. Himmler did none of that. It was just talk. Plausible deniability. Remember, the Vatican controls Hitler. Hitler is working for the Vatican. All right? The world buys these lies. This author obviously buys these lies. It says it is important, and I want to go back to what I brought up earlier. See what role the Catholic churches play in time of war. I've said many times on Inquisition Update that the Roman Catholic churches and other Roman Catholic institutions in the United States share the same sovereignty as the Vatican. They're owned by the Vatican, and they're regarded as sacrosanct. You can't just willy-nilly enter a Roman Catholic institution, whether it be a cathedral or a local church, without the approval of the bishop. And if a bank robber crosses the threshold of a Roman Catholic church seeking protection and asylum, if he happens to be a Roman Catholic, he has that protection. And the civil power, the civil authorities can't follow him across the threshold of the church and arrest him. And even if they do, the Roman Catholic Church can stop the arrest and can free the individual back to the protection of the church. That's what is achieved through Roman Catholic concordats with host nations. Wherever the Roman Catholic Church exists, wherever they have written a contract, a concordat with the government, the civil government of the world, it protects that sanctity of the Roman Catholic churches. They're essentially asylums. And the only authority over that church is the Roman Catholic bishop, the local bishop. He has more authority than the civil power. Now, authorities cannot cross the threshold of a Roman Catholic church without the approval of the bishop. See how the United States government protects the Roman Catholic Church. And that's why, in times of war, Roman Catholic churches are used as undergrounds. And these Roman Catholic churches are overseen by local priests and bishops. They're warriors against your own government. And we determined in the book The Vatican Billions by Avril Manhattan that it's the shadow government. It actually has more power than the visible civil government of the country. Now, he says it is important to revisit here again the stubborn refusal of Pope Pius IX way back in 1870 to accept the conditions of Italy's law of guarantees and the reduction in legal status of Holy See concordats and other diplomatic exchanges. Had he capitulated, there would have been no such thing as the Vatican city-state, nor in all likelihood would the historic role of the Holy See as a diplomatic presence throughout the world have been maintained. I would just add, if it hadn't been for Pope Pius IX, and his refusal to accept guarantees from a civil government, had he not protected the sovereignty and sanctity of the Vatican itself and the power vested in the Pope, then Roman Catholic churches wouldn't be a refuge for anybody. Their thresholds would be open to the civil power. You see what I mean? This author is crediting Pope Pius IX, who many Roman Catholics say it was discredited when he wrote his Syllabus of Error, condemning all liberal forms of government, all constitutional forms of government. At the same time, praise him for protecting the sanctity and sovereignty of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, had Pope Pius allowed concordats to be reduced to non-treaty level agreements, as Prince von Metternich and others demanded, the Holy See might have lost its recognition and perception as an institutional sovereign. Then matters could have turned out very differently. The Vatican, as Italian soil, not Vatican soil, but Italian soil, in the case where the Vatican was not sacrosanct, it says the Vatican, as Italian soil, would have been subject to fascist rule when Mussolini came to power, and then subject to Nazi rule after the Germans took over Rome. The diplomats inside would have enjoyed no immunity. Refugees under the Vatican's protection would have been exposed. All of the Catholic Church's property in Rome would have come under Adolf Hitler's control. You see, even when Adolf Hitler invaded Italy, he had no power in the Vatican or in the Roman Catholic churches in Italy. Now, the Holy See waited nearly 60 years to come to terms with the government of Italy, as it finally did in the Lateran Treaty, but the wait was worth it. The notice posted at entrances to the Vatican, quote, "The governor of Vatican City, on the orders of the Secretary of State Cardinal Maglione, declares that this entrance to Vatican City, which is a sovereign and independent neutral state, enjoy the right of inviolability," unquote. That meant something, even to Adolf Hitler, who had respected the sovereignty of no one. Very, very powerful. Adolf Hitler tread over borders, over people, over institutions. There was no restraint on Adolf Hitler except the invisible line drawn around the Vatican and around Roman Catholic churches. That sanctity he did not violate. And that exposes who really was the God of Adolf Hitler. Of course, Hitler, according to the author, could have taken the Vatican had he chosen to do so, Lateran Treaty or not. That he did not suggests he feared the response such a violation would incite. Possibly he considered the reaction of his own 20 million or so Catholics who had submitted to his rule thus far, but might bridle at a German attack on the Vatican. All we know for certain is that something held Hitler back. The white line around the Vatican was one line he would not cross. Could it be that Hitler was afraid of the same result and circumstance surrounding the excommunication of German King Henry IV? Excommunication and eternal damnation. That was the invisible force that held Hitler from crossing the lines of the Vatican, besides the fact that he was completely complicit with the Pope in conducting the Second World War. The targeted people were killed. The Jews, especially those who would never go back to Israel without God's miraculous right arm to bring them. And the Orthodox, who had been regarded since 1054 AD as schismatics, the Orthodox Christians and Protestants. The numbers assassinated and killed during the Second World War have never been calculated. Never been calculated. We know there were over 2 million Orthodox killed in the former Yugoslavia. We know there were 6 million Jews killed in the Second World War. No calculations ever been made of the Protestants. Why is that? This raises again the old question, could Pope Pius XII have done more to deter Hitler from the start? Did he underestimate his own moral authority in confronting Hitler? Did he fear Hitler's power too much, failing to realize that Hitler feared his power too? It's all theater. Don't forget, listener, this is all theater. He said these questions are especially pointed in regards to the Roman Jews whose deportation was ordered by the Nazis starting on October 16, 1943. German troops raided Rome's Jewish ghetto, where about 8,000 Jews lived, and began transporting them by train to Auschwitz. Approximately 2,000 of these Romans, including many children, would eventually be killed. Some critics have asserted that Pope Pius XII did not do enough to save the Roman Jews, even arguing that the Pope complied with the capture and deportation of the city's Jewish citizens. Others have studied the matter, however, strongly disagree with that assessment. Michael Tagliacozzo, an Italian and Jewish historian who is a leading expert on Nazi war crimes in Rome, and he himself a survivor of the Nazi roundup in Rome, concludes that Pius did protest on behalf of Rome's Jews and devoted Vatican resources to hiding thousands of Jews from the Nazis. The controversy regarding Pope Pius XII's behavior toward the Jews, either in Rome or elsewhere in Europe, is unlikely to die anytime soon, and it certainly will not end here, says the author. The argument that Pius could have used moral suasion to mobilize opposition to Hitler, that he failed to deploy his soft power as aggressively as he might have, will continue to be a part of his legacy. It will continue to be a part of his legacy until Christ returns and exposes the truth. I believe Christ can literally rewind the tape and let us all see with our own eyes and ears the relationship between Adolf Hitler and Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII. God hasten the day. We'll be back right after these messages. You're listening to the Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
years ahead of the dominant media. FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to continue listening to Inquisition Update on this network, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. If you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Now we'll continue where we left off before the break. It says the fairest assessment of Pope Pius XII probably belongs to Harold Tittman, who had his own frustrations with the Pope, but came to the conclusion, after living through the war inside the Vatican, that Pius XII chose the best route, knowing what he knew at the time, and that he really could not in good conscience have acted other than as he did. Quote, "If he had spoken out, would there have been fewer victims or more?" Tittman asks. "Personally, I cannot help feel that the Holy Father, quote unquote, chose the better path by not speaking out and thereby saved many lives," unquote. Now remember, Tittman was the right hand of Myron Taylor, who was the right hand of Roosevelt. Roosevelt. Now, certainly they're going to vindicate Pius XII. Roosevelt was a 33rd degree Freemason. He was a crusader in the war, just as was Adolf Hitler. And the papacy has to be exonerated. Never should the world ever conceive that the papacy was behind the whole thing. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, despite his public proclamation that that is what he is. You see how easily the world is deceived? And the deception only comes when we fail to recognize in the Bible who is spoken of. When the Bible makes mention of the man of sin, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist, the little horn with eyes like eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking blasphemies against the Most High. That's none other than the papacy. And once one concludes that it is the papacy, and there's not even another possibility, not even another candidate on the earth for the role of Antichrist, the little horn, the man of sin, and the son of perdition, then we simply can just plug and chug. When we read the Bible and we read history, they melt together like butter on butter. All of a sudden, the Bible makes sense. All of a sudden, history makes sense. But if something within us leaves room for doubt about who the Antichrist is, then you can be deceived by anybody. To think that the scriptures leave absolutely no possibility for doubt about who the Messiah was. Which one of us would dare suggest that God would leave us just as clueless about the identity of the Antichrist? It's not so. We know with a surety that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. And just as surely, we can know who his counterfeit is by biblical description and by historical fulfillment. No question about it. Now, in his 1997 book entitled The Myth of Rescue, British historian William Rubinstein argues that it's a mistake to think that anyone could have stopped Hitler with mere words. Though not writing specifically about the Pope, Rubinstein addresses a criticism directed against leaders of Allied nations, as well as against Jews who lived in the United States during the war, that they did too little to save the Jews in Europe. Quote, "Not one plan or proposal made anywhere in the democracies by either Jews or non-Jewish champions of the Jews after the Nazi conquest of Europe could have rescued one single Jew who perished in the Holocaust." Unquote. Blaming presidents and prime ministers and popes for the sins of a madman may give satisfaction at some level, but it is absurd, says this author. The American army entered Rome on June 4th, 1944. 2 days later, on D-Day, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The war still had another year to go, but Rome at least was free. Shortly after American troops took control of the city, the head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, Knight of Malta, oath-spitting warrior of the Pope, William Donovan, arrived to make changes in American spy operations in Italy. Wild Bill Donovan, as he was called, had created the American Intelligence Service during the war, and now that the war was winding down, he looked forward to creating a post-war successor, the Central Intelligence Agency. Before leaving Rome, Donovan visited the Vatican and met with Pope Pius XII. Donovan, a Roman Catholic, a papist, whose first allegiance was the papacy, just as was Roosevelt's, founder of the OSS, the forerunner of what today is known as the CIA. I asked my listeners, who do you think runs the CIA? The Vatican. It's just an extension of the Vatican's vast global intelligence system. And it's an integral part of the United States government. And the CIA literally leads American foreign policy. It's financed by a black budget. It's unaccountable to the American citizens. If it's unaccountable to the American citizens, to whom does it account? Why, of course, to those who run it. There was a purpose behind the close relationship between the United States and the Vatican. There was a purpose behind it. And we have it, the CIA. Now, Donovan had realized during the war that the Catholic Church, with its own network of clergy and religious, spread wide and deep around the world, was a valuable resource for the spy agency. He had written President Roosevelt back in 1942 about having met with Cardinal Cicognini about providing the United States all material the Vatican had obtained through its diplomatic channels. Furthermore, an extensive organization run by a Belgian priest named Felix Morleone, for example, had accumulated information and personal insights from priests and parishioners throughout Europe. A very good gauge of popular attitudes in warring nations. What did I tell you earlier? The Vatican was questioning whether the information it had was true or wartime propaganda. Now the author admits that the information that gathered by the Vatican was the most reliable information was gathered from its own priests and parishioners all throughout Europe. You see, if you read carefully with a critical eye and a critical ear, this author will eventually tell you the truth. Do you really think Pope Pius XII wasn't sure his information was reliable and therefore hesitated to condemn Adolf Hitler, or was that just an excuse? He had the best information from the most reliable sources, boots on the ground in every city in Europe, who saw with the Pope's eyes and heard with the Pope's ears, and they reported what they saw and what they heard to the papacy, and it was with that information that the papacy made its decisions. And that's why the Pope never criticized Adolf Hitler. And that's also why the governments of the world did not criticize Adolf Hitler and his extermination of the Jews. Because had they done so, they would have defied their own Pope. The papacy wanted the Jews dead. Why? Because they wouldn't go back to Israel. The Jews that survived would be used to create the modern nation state of Israel, so that the papacy had an Israel foundation for this new temple and a new peace treaty, a 7-year peace treaty with the Jews, to deceive the whole world, to run the greatest deception since the Garden of Eden. And the whole world buys the lies. And it's time for us to recognize the truth. and to repent of futurism. Repent of ecumenism. And remember who the Antichrist is. Return to true biblical Protestantism before it's too late. He says Donovan hoped for more of the same. On his visit, as if to prime the pump, Donovan fed Pope Pius XII a piece of information American intelligence agents had discovered. Japanese agents working within Japan's mission to the Holy See were about to install a radio transmitter in their embassy offices to secretly transmit information back to Tokyo. The Pope thanked Donovan for the tip and vowed to deal with it. A small matter, but it was the start of an important alliance between the Vatican and American intelligence. I insist that the cooperation between Vatican and U.S. intelligence long preceded William Donovan. But nonetheless, the CIA is a Roman Catholic institution run by the Vatican for the benefit of the Vatican. And it also works domestically against the Constitution to help conquer the United States for the papacy. And the target in the United States of the papacy is Protestantism. That's the target. Are we just going to sit by and be victims? Or are we going to sound the trumpet of warning? I intend to sound the trumpet of warning to my dying breath. Now, Chapter 8 is entitled Common Ground. It begins with a quote from Harry S. Truman, another papist in Protestant garb. He says, both religion and democracy are founded on one basic principle, the worth and dignity of the individual man and woman, unquote. And my impression of that is, he is stealing language directly from the papacy, who constantly talks of the dignity of man. When our Bible reminds us that the heart of man is sinfully wicked, who can know it? It's the understanding of the sinful nature of man that we can understand that no good government is ever going to come from man, especially from one man, the Pope of Rome, the Antichrist of the Bible. Now the chapter begins, the war in Europe came to a quick and dramatic conclusion in the spring of 1945. That April brought the deaths of three of the war's main players. Franklin Roosevelt suffered a massive stroke on April 12th. Mussolini was found in hiding and executed on April 28th. And Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, so they say, I will add. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. 3 months later, President Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And very adept researchers have discovered that the reason Hiroshima and Nagasaki were targeted was because they were Jesuit cities. And Japan kicked the Jesuits out. And to mark the scene of that crime, they chose strategically Hiroshima and Nagasaki to make the point clear to the Japanese. If you defy the Jesuits, you will pay. Very astute research. Now it says the dust and ashes of the war had hardly settled when a new conflict began, one that would be even more threatening to world peace and would last much longer than the one just ended. The Cold War would persist through 9 American presidents and 5 popes, framing international relations during the decades between the World War II and the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989. Now look, the Cold War is just an add-on to this global crusade that started with the First World War. It's to bring in a global government and to subject Christ's people to the rule of Antichrist. That's what it's all about. And then to foment this futurist interpretation of Daniel 9:27, as I've said so many times. I hope the listeners don't come to the conclusion that this is so redundant as to be monotonous, because no matter what, Rome's effort is going to be to take our understanding away from us. And so I want to keep futurism in the front of my discussions always, because it is the absolute main objective in all of this. Now, along the way, the Cold War drew the United States and the Holy See into an extraordinary relationship, changing the course of history. I would say the relationship between the United States and the Vatican were already extraordinary, but the Cold War just tightened that relationship. And it had global consequences, even more so than the First and Second World Wars. Now, he says, historians correctly credit President Roosevelt with opening modern relations with the papacy during the Second World War. Less recognized are the overtures made by the to the Vatican by President Truman in the early years of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union grabbed land and power throughout Eastern Europe. Almost from the day he entered office, Truman understood, perhaps better than Roosevelt, that the Soviets and their communist associates must be halted. The challenge of accomplishing this intensified through the course of his presidency, becoming dramatically more urgent in 1949 when the Soviets debuted their atomic bomb and the communist forces under Mao Zedong took control of China. Since direct confrontation with the Soviets risked nuclear conflagration, efforts to contain communism were asymmetrical in nature. The fight was waged at local levels, in covert operations and limited engagement proxy wars in the jungles of Asia and Central America, on the plains of Africa and the mountains of Afghanistan, on Caribbean islands and Arabian deserts, anywhere the communists hoped to gain a foothold, and the United States intended to prevent that. The truth about the Cold War that Harry Truman instinctively grasped from the start, however, was that victory would ultimately owe less to the hard power of bullets and bombs than to the soft power of morals and principles grounded in faith. And I would just ask my listeners, what faith do you believe drove Harry Truman? Roman Catholicism. It says America and her allies, in other words, needed religion to prevail. Above all, they needed the Roman Catholic Church. Yes, they desperately need the Scarlet Harlot on the Tiber. Your government, your country, that's supposed to be Protestant, desperately needs the relationship with the Scarlet Harlot on the Tiber. What does that say about your country? What does that say about Protestantism in America? And what does it bode for the future of Protestantism and Protestants in America? We're going to have another crusade right here in the country. Right here in the United States of America. Protestants are going to be demonized as radical fundamentalists, just like they demonized the radical fundamentalist Muslims. It was all in preparation for labeling us the same target. They're going to have their global government, and religion is going to be the basis of it, but Protestantism is not welcome to the party. You need to know what history has prepared us for. You need to know what the Bible has prepared us for. Suffering and persecution and tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And it's going to last far longer than 7 years, trust me. He says, on March 6, 1946, a day after watching former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, President Truman gave his own important Cold War speech in nearby Columbus, Missouri, to a Protestant organization called the Federal Council of Churches. First of all, I'm going to ask my listeners, why would any Protestant church organize under an institution called the Federal Council of Churches? Who's the head of the Federal Council of Churches? Is it Christ or the federal government? And why is the head of the federal government Harry Truman addressing these Protestants? Look at how he addresses them. He said Truman did not mention the Cold War by name. The term was not yet coined. Nor did he mention the Soviet Union, but his speech sounded themes that would define his approach to the Cold War. Quote, "In our relations abroad and in our economy at home, forces of selfishness and greed and intolerance are again at work. They create situations which call for hard decisions, for forthrightness, for courage and determination. But above everything else, they call for one thing, without which we are lost. They call for a moral and spiritual awakening in the life of the individual and in the councils of the world. If the civilized world as we know it today is to survive, the gigantic power which man has acquired through atomic energy must be matched by spiritual strength and of a greater magnitude. All mankind now stands in the doorway to destruction, or upon the threshold of the greatest age in history. And I prefer to face the great age. Only a high moral standard can master this new power of the universe and develop it for the common good." Do you understand the language this president's using? We now have the threat of nuclear annihilation, global destruction, and we must meet that threat with an even greater spiritual power. And guess where he instructed these Protestants to get that spiritual power? From the Roman Catholic Church. The author continues, he says, "A devout Baptist, Truman saw religious faith with its emphasis on, quote, the worth and dignity of the individual man and woman, unquote, as the fundamental precondition for personal freedom and world order, and as the antidote to communist totalitarianism." This was not simply a spiritual epiphany for Truman, it was a mission statement. Quote, "This is the supreme opportunity for the church to continue to fulfill its mission on earth. The Protestant Church, the Catholic Church, and the Jewish synagogue, bound together in the American unity of brotherhood, must provide the shock forces to accomplish this moral and spiritual awakening. No other agency can do it. Unless it is done, we are headed for disaster we would deserve." Unquote. What's the message? If Protestants and Catholics and Jews do not unite and provide the world that spiritual power based in Roman Catholicism, then we deserve the destruction that we're going to get. That's about as ecumenical a statement as you'll ever get. Was Truman truly a Baptist? I'll guarantee you one thing, if Truman was truly a Baptist, he was a futurist Baptist, projecting the rise of Antichrist way off in the distant future and exonerating the papacy, thereby making the papacy the spiritual leader of the Protestant church. And therein lies the destruction of America. Therein lies the destruction of the world. To hand the power, the spiritual power of Protestantism, over to the Vatican is treason against the Most High. And Truman sung the praises of the Antichrist of the Bible, the papacy. When will it ever end? When will the Protestant eyes and ears ever be opened in this country? I'll be back tomorrow on Inquisition Update.